Hello, Year 10, and welcome to A Christmas Carol. Before we get going with the reading, I am going to talk you through just a few bits that you might want to have near you as you read along with me. So you can see that I have a copy of the PDF of A Christmas Carol in this lovely plastic wallet. I'm going to be keeping my copy inside this plastic wallet along with any flashcards that I make so that everything's in one place. You might want to think about doing that yourself. Now, you might have a copy of the book. If so, then that's wonderful and you can definitely annotate straight into there. Otherwise, the PDF is on the VLE. You can download it and print it. If you do not have the capacity to print the PDF, then do not worry. You can just read along on the screen with me, and instead of annotating directly onto the text, make some flashcards of all the key quotes that we cover. I will stop and tell you what quotes you need to make flashcards for, and I will talk you through the annotations as we go. Other things you might need to have with you, I would definitely suggest a highlighter. I would definitely suggest a biro for making notes, and if you have a copy of the book and you have any little post-its for marking important pages, then have those as well. Okay, let's get ready and go. Right, Year 10, let's get started. So we're going to go straight in to Stave 1 and we're going to read the first 7 pages. So in the absence of a ruler, I'm going to mark where we are with a knitting needle. Okay, off we go. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now, this is not one of our key quotes that we're going to be making flashcards for, but if you're wanting to challenge yourself and to annotate quotes that go beyond the bare essentials, I would definitely highlight that. Now, the reason that this is an interesting quote is because as the first quote of the novel, it establishes that the story is something out of the ordinary. So this is going to be a ghost story. So we're going to annotate it with So it establishes the ghost story. And it creates suspense. It is what we call a hook. Okay, so that's a structural point. Dickens is dragging us in to the story by writing something that's quite unusual. Right, let's continue. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Okay, so here you'll notice that we get this my coming in. I, my. We've got this first person coming in. And this is Dickens's voice. So he's trying to make the story a little bit light-hearted by inserting his own voice into it. So we could just make a little comment at the side that this is Dickens's voice. And that creates humour. Scrooge knew he was dead, Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnised it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. So, over these past couple of paragraphs, we've established that Scrooge was in business with a man called Marley. And when Marley died, Scrooge was responsible for administrating everything, dealing with the paperwork for his death, and he was the only person to turn up to Marley's funeral. So that might give you a good idea of what kind of person Marley was, and maybe even what kind of person that Scrooge is. Now, if you've got your highlighter at the ready and you have a printed copy, then we're about to start doing some annotations for your key quotes. There are 3 key quotes today, so if you don't have a copy, get some flashcards ready. This is just an old picture that my daughter made that I've just chopped up, so any paper will do. It's just for self-testing, okay? So make sure you can write on both sides. Right, so we're moving on to this bottom paragraph. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Right, so we are going to highlight the following quotes. A tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Okay, so to understand this metaphor, you need to understand the term tight-fisted. So imagine a fist clenched really, really tight. It suggests that there's something in there that you don't want to let go of. Now, if you call someone tight-fisted, it means that you think that they don't like to spend money or give it away. Okay, so this metaphor is a common phrase. So let's annotate that. So tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Got a metaphor. Suggesting he's not generous with money. Okay, but it's also a hand at the grindstone. So in order to understand this metaphor, you need to think about a grindstone, so something hard, something rough that you would use to grind things down. Okay, so imagine anything that you would use to break things down. So maybe a pestle and mortar that you grind up spices, or maybe a millstone, one of those circular stones with a hole in the middle that they grind up flour. Okay, so the idea is that he's hard and he's cold and he wears people down. So grindstone is a really important word. Okay, so if you need to copy that down, then pause this video now. Okay, so moving on to our next quote, we're going to do our 3 quotes before we do our flashcards. Hard and sharp as flint. Okay, so this is of course a simile because it uses like or as. Okay, and this simile compares him to flint. Now flint is a grey stone that you chip off in almost like sheets. So cavemen use flint as tools, so you can cut off a shard and you can use it for chopping things. Prehistoric man would put it on the end of wood as a spear. So it's associated with cutting and stabbing, you know, with violence. So it's a stone, flint, associated with violence and harm. And the idea that he's hard and sharp, well, we've got the adjective hard, which connotes a lack of empathy. If you are a hard person, you don't soften to others, you don't have that empathy and that warmth. And then we've got sharp, which suggests that he's someone who's quite hurtful, so he can hurt others. Okay, if you need to copy that down, pause now. Okay, and our last quote. So, as solitary as an oyster. It's one of my favourite quotes in this whole novel because it's a great quote for alternative interpretations. Now, if you are aiming for a grade 7 or above, then you need to be introducing alternative interpretations into your analysis. So, solitary as an oyster, as you will have noticed, is a simile. Okay, so solitary, suggesting that he's lonely or alone. So if you are solitary, you are on your own. Now an oyster, as hopefully you know, is one of those, it's sort of, we associate it with seafood, but it's one of those shelled sea creatures. Fish? Is it a fish? I don't think it's a fish. And inside the shell you get pearls, don't you? So so the comparison to an oyster suggests that he's hard and he's closed off to other people. So again, we've said hard connotes a lack of empathy, but this idea that he's closed, he won't open up. Now, I wouldn't recommend in your analysis that you explain a metaphor or a simile with another metaphor. So you need to make sure that you are clear on what I mean by won't open up. So this idea that he will not form personal relationships with people, he won't be friendly. Okay, now, as I've said, it's really important to have an alternative interpretation. So, let's get that highlighted. So if you're aiming for a 7 or higher, you need that alternative interpretation. So we've got the simile where we've got the comparison to an oyster. So he's hard, he's closed and he won't open up. That's negative. But on the positive side, there is beauty within him in the form of the pearl. Okay, right, copy that down. If you've not got those annotations down, then can you pause the video now and get them copied? Okay, so we're going to move on to our flashcards now. Now the flashcards have to have two sides. So on the first side you don't want to write down the quote, but you want to have some prompts to put the quote into context so you can guess it. So you need to put the 5 W's. Where in the novel is it from? Who is it about? What is it about? When does it happen? And why? Why is this quote in there? What was Dickens trying to show? So, we're going to look at this quote, a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. And we'll do the first one together, and then you can do the next two by yourself. So here is the first side. So, where? So this quote, tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, happens in Stave 1. I want to be a little bit more specific than just Stave 1, so it's in the opening description of Scrooge. The who. Who's it about? Well, obviously it's about Scrooge. What are we told? What's it about? It's about Scrooge being ungenerous. Ungenerous, is that a word? Stingy. Tight-fisted. When does it occur? So it doesn't really occur at any specific moment in time, but I would say it probably happens after the death of Marley. So we've established the death of Marley, and then Scrooge is described as he survives him. And then why? Why has Dickens included this quote in the novel? I think it's to establish Scrooge as a villainous character. So he is the villain of the novel. So we want to dislike him. We want to think he's negative. So, on the opposite side, we're going to write down the quote and our language analysis of it. But if you need to copy this down onto your flashcard, please pause the video now. Right, so let's turn over and let's do our language analysis. So the first thing you need to do is write down your quote. So, you can go with tight-fisted, you can go with tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. I'm going to use the whole quote because I think grindstone's an interesting word. So we've got our quote. So our first bullet point is to pick out interesting words. I think we've got lots of interesting words here. So tight, this idea that you're not letting go of something. It links to grasping, clutching. Now this word covetous, if you're not sure what that means, it means that you want something that someone else has got. So you are looking at other things and thinking, I want that, I want that. So that's what covetous means. But tight definitely links to grasping and clutching. So we could even go into an alternative interpretation here. So tight, won't let go. This could be due to greed, or it could be due to fear. So we've got an alternative interpretation there. So let's highlight that in orange because that's my colour for my grade 7 ideas. Should always put our zooms in quotation marks. I also think that this word fisted is interesting. So a fist we associate with violence, don't we? So the fist. So an open hand, openness, honesty, but a fist is quite tense and it's quite violent. And then I also talked about the grindstone. So it's cold, it's hard, and it wears people down. Squeeze down that down. Cold hard wears people down. Right, so those 3 zooms. Oh my goodness, if I wrote those 3 zooms up in my exam, the examiner would love me. Now, the next thing we need to do once we've done our zooms, and you can just do one. So if in, one of your quotes that you're going to do on your own, you can only zoom in on one word, that's absolutely fine. But because I can zoom in on 3, that's what I'm going to do. So what does the quote say? So the quote says that Scrooge does not like to spend or share money. What is the language technique? So a language technique is a metaphor. And what is the context? I'm going to have to squeeze this in, but this is the lack of generosity and the greed of businessmen in the Victorian era. Okay, so let's just zoom in on that slightly so you can copy it down. There you go. Right, pause now if you need to copy it. Okay, right, the only other thing I would say about this that I realised I forgot to do when we were annotating is that you've probably noticed that that word grindstone links to flint. So I'm just going to underline that because one of the things that high-level students do, especially when they're given an extract in their exam, is that they pick out a pattern in language. Okay, it's like a semantic field. So I'm just going to make a little note here that that's what connects them. Okay. Make sure you've got all of this down. So before we move on, make sure you've got flashcards for all 3 of your quotes. Okay, so just follow the same process. We've got the quote, the zoom, what it tells us, language technique, and context. And then we've got who, what, when, where, why. Right, so we're going to continue reading now. So knitting needles at the ready. I'm going to start from the cold within him. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So Dickens describes Scrooge is not particularly attractive. This is something that's quite common in Victorian literature. If you want to establish that someone is not very pleasant, then you describe them as not very pleasant looking. But what's interesting about this is that Dickens is suggesting that Scrooge's cruelty and Scrooge's unpleasant personality has made him unattractive and unappealing, so his cheek has shriveled and his voice has become grating because he has been cruel. Right, carrying on. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him, it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and it was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. Okay, so just to establish that he's in his counting house, so we find out that Scrooge's job is something to do with counting money. So as you can imagine, he is a man of finance, and it is suggested later on in the novel that he lends money and then takes it back with interest. So lends people money and then they give him back more than he's lent them, and that's how he makes his profit. So he is a man whose entire life revolves around. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter, tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. Okay, so we're just going to highlight a couple of quotes from here. So Scrooge has got a clerk, sort of like an admin assistant, so someone who does his paperwork for him. And in the counting house, which is his office, they are separated. They don't have quite a room or an office to one another, but they have a dividing wall, a bit like a cell, and this dividing wall, given that they call it a tank, probably has glass between them, so he can see what his clerk is doing, but they are divided, they are separate. So this idea backs up that quote, solitary as an oyster. So obviously the fact that it's a cell connotes prison cell. So it's almost like he's punishing his clerk, but it also links to solitary as an oyster. And then we have the description that Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. So we've got this description of the fire as looking like there's just one lump of coal in there. So it's imagery to emphasize Scrooge's lack of generosity. So you would expect an employer to want to keep their employees comfortable so they can be productive. However, Scrooge does not look after his employee and keeps him quite cold, quite uncomfortable, and is just plain mean to him and treats him as if he is below himself because his fire is smaller. Okay, moving on. Right, so now we're going to meet Fred. A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you! Cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. Bah! Said Scrooge. Handbag! He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. Christmas a humbug, Uncle, said Scrooge's nephew. You don't mean that, I'm sure. I do, said Scrooge. Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. Come then, returned the nephew gaily. What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough. Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said Bah! Again, and followed it up with Handbag. Don't be cross, Uncle, said the nephew. Okay, we're going to pause there. Just to pick out a few things about Fred. So, we see that he says, God save you. So, thinking about Dickens's London, he's writing in the Victorian times, a lot more religious than society is today. So Fred is clearly a religious man. He's speaking in a way that tells us he's a Christian. So that is meant to represent his goodness. Scrooge, on the other hand, never mentions religion, so his kind of godlessness is seen as his failing. Moving down, we've got a contrast between Scrooge and his nephew. So Scrooge on the previous page is seen to be frosty, whereas Fred, we've got this semantic field of light here to represent how he is a good person. So we've got glow and we've got sparkled. So those are positive traits. Probably should have done that in blue like I did last time. Right. So let's move on. We were at Don't be cross, Uncle, said the nephew. What else can I be, returned the uncle, when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas? Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through around dozens of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will, said Scrooge indignantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should. Uncle, pleaded the nephew. So, I think this quote really sums up Scrooge, doesn't it? So he thinks that people who celebrate Christmas, a religious holiday and a time for goodness and goodwill in all men, he sees it as idiotic. So sees generosity and Christianity as foolish or idiotic. Okay, and then he says should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. Now, you might obviously notice that boiled and buried are quite violent. So we've got some violent verbs there. But we've also got this, a stake of holly through his heart. So we've got language or imagery that is reminiscent of vampires. Now, I know you're all sat at home thinking, wow, miss, that is ironic, because Scrooge is the vampire himself. He is sucking the life out of those around him. You're right. So let's mark this as irony. Okay, if you just want to pause those and get those annotations down. Right, moving on. Nephew, returned the uncle sternly, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, repeated Scrooge's nephew, but you don't keep it. By keep it here they mean celebrate it or observe it. Let me leave it alone then, said Scrooge. Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say, returned the nephew, Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark for ever. So the clerk, who's in the tank, so enjoys Fred's speech that he gives him a little round of applause and then realises that that's improper, so he shouldn't be celebrating something that makes his employer annoyed, and so he goes and busies himself with the fire like nothing doing here. Scrooge, however, notices. He says, "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." So he threatens the clerk that he will fire him if he hears another sound from him. So he's quite cruel, isn't he? But his nephew, despite the fact that he's so horrible and unpleasant, his nephew still invites him round for Christmas dinner. So we really see that generosity there. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing more in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I'm sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We never had any quarrel to which I've been a party, but I've made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, "and a Happy New Year." So that's all we're going to read today, guys. In 2 lessons' time, we'll read the other half of Stave 1. For now, you've got your flashcards and a 5 bullet point summary to complete.